The hum of the aircraft engines was a comforting backdrop as passengers settled into their seats, some flipping through in-flight magazines, others lost in conversations or scrolling through their phones. Flight 287 from Chicago to Atlanta had been uneventful so far. But everything was about to change in a way no one could have anticipated. Sophia Carter, a poised and confident Black woman in her early 30s, sat near the aisle in the economy section, a book open on her lap. A senior operations manager for Liberty Airways, Sophia was no stranger to travel. Today, though, she wasn't flying for work. She was returning home after visiting family for the holidays. Her sharp eyes occasionally darted toward the flight attendants as they moved up and down the aisle, her professional instincts ever observant. But Sophia's calm demeanor was interrupted when the voice of Captain Logan Miller, the pilot, came over the intercom. His tone was clipped, almost mechanical. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a slight technical issue. Please remain seated and await further instructions." Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, that announcement breaking the fragile cocoon of in-flight normalcy. Sophia noticed a young flight attendant, Mia Harper, whispering urgently with another crew member. Something wasn't right. Her instincts told her this was more than a routine announcement. Minutes later, a stern-faced police officer boarded the plane. The murmurs of passengers grew louder, their collective anxiety filling the cabin. The officer, a white man in his 40s with a rigid stance and an air of authority, moved deliberately down the aisle. His eyes scanned the rows of passengers, stopping when he reached Sophia. "You," he said, pointing at her with a gesture that silenced the whispers. "I need you to come with me." Sophia blinked, confused but composed. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the clear tension. "We've received information that requires us to detain you," the officer replied, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The cabin erupted into gasps and murmurs. "What's going on?" someone whispered loudly from a few rows back. Sophia looked around, her gaze landing on passengers whose expressions ranged from shocked to suspicious. She could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken judgments forming in their minds. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," Sophia said calmly. "What information are you referring to?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he gestured again, his impatience evident. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me. Now." Sophia hesitated for a moment, then stood, her book slipping from her lap onto the seat. As she stepped into the aisle, her mind raced. She hadn't done anything wrong, so why was she being targeted? She could feel her pulse quicken, but her outward demeanor remained calm. Years of navigating tense situations in the corporate world had taught her the importance of composure. As she walked toward the front of the plane, escorted by the officer, whispers trailed behind her. Did she do something? Why her? This feels wrong. Sophia glanced over her shoulder briefly, her eyes meeting those of a little girl staring at her with wide, curious eyes. The child's innocence contrasted sharply with the harshness of the situation. At the front of the plane, the officer stopped and turned to face her. "You're being accused of theft," he said bluntly. "We have reason to believe you're in possession of another passenger's property." Sophia's eyes widened in disbelief. "Theft? That's ridiculous. I haven't taken anything." The officer's expression remained unmoved. "We'll sort this out at the station." Before Sophia could respond, a voice broke through the tension. "Wait." It was Mia, the young flight attendant. Her voice was shaky but determined. "This doesn't seem right. I think there's been a mistake." The officer turned to Mia, his expression darkening. "Stay out of this, miss. This is official business." Sophia seized the moment. "If you're accusing me of theft, I'd like to know what evidence you have," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "I have the right to know why I'm being treated like this." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another voice chimed in, this one deeper and more commanding. "That's enough." It was Captain Logan Miller, stepping out of the cockpit. His presence only heightened the tension in the cabin. His sharp uniform and confident stride might have reassured passengers under normal circumstances, but today, his entrance felt more like an escalation. Sophia turned to face him, her posture unwavering. "Captain Miller," she said coolly. "Perhaps you can explain why I'm being treated like a criminal on your flight." Miller's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're trying to resolve a sensitive matter, Miss Carter," he said. "Please cooperate." "Resolve?" Sophia's voice didn't waver. "By publicly humiliating me without a shred of evidence, this isn't a resolution. It's an injustice." The cabin fell silent. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, hanging on to every word. Even the officer hesitated, unsure how to proceed in the face of Sophia's unwavering confidence. Then, with a calm but commanding tone that seemed to echo through the entire plane, Sophia said a single sentence that would leave everyone speechless. "If you truly believe I'm guilty, let's review the security footage right here, right now." Her words sliced through the tension like a knife. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. All eyes were on Captain Miller and the officer, their authority now visibly shaken. For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the cabin hung heavy in the air as passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity mingled with discomfort. Even the officer seemed caught off guard by Sophia's confident challenge. Reviewing security footage wasn't standard protocol, and her insistence was a bold move. Captain Miller cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Miss Carter," he began cautiously, "security footage isn't something we can access on the plane. This isn't the place for an investigation." Sophia's sharp eyes didn't waver. "Exactly," she said. "So why am I being publicly accused and dragged to the front of this plane like a criminal? If this situation is as serious as you're making it seem, then follow proper procedures, but I will not allow you to strip me of my dignity based on vague accusations." Murmurs rippled through the cabin again. Passengers leaned closer to their neighbors, whispering, "She's got a point, and this doesn't feel right." Others, however, remained skeptical, their expressions guarded. The officer, clearly unsettled, adjusted his stance and tried to regain control. "Ms. Carter, this isn't the time for a debate. We have protocols to follow, and you need to cooperate. If you're innocent, this can be sorted out after we land." Sophia took a steady breath, keeping her voice calm but firm. "You've already disrupted this entire flight with your actions. If you truly had evidence against me, why not address it quietly and discreetly? Instead, you chose to humiliate me in front of all these people. So I'll ask again, what proof do you have?" At that moment, the whispers grew louder, and a few passengers began recording the confrontation on their phones. Sophia noticed the cameras but didn't let them distract her. If anything, they gave her a small sense of reassurance. If this ordeal escalated further, there would be evidence of how it had unfolded. Meanwhile, Mia, the young flight attendant, hovered nearby, her anxiety evident. She stepped closer, wringing her hands nervously. "Captain," she said hesitantly, her voice trembling, "maybe we should consider handling this differently. Miss Carter has a point. This whole thing feels off." Captain Miller shot her a warning glance, but Mia stood her ground, her cheeks flushed with nervous determination. Sophia glanced at the flight attendant and gave her a slight nod, silently thanking her for the support. Before Miller could respond, an older woman sitting near the front of the plane suddenly spoke up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. She was dressed in a tailored suit, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. "I think we all deserve an explanation. What exactly has Ms. Carter been accused of?" The officer hesitated, clearly unprepared for the growing scrutiny. "A passenger reported a missing item," he said vaguely. "We're following up on that report." The older woman raised an eyebrow. "And you decided that Miss Carter was the culprit without conducting a thorough investigation. That doesn't sound like due process to me." Sophia turned to the woman and gave her a small, grateful smile. It was clear that the tide of public opinion in the cabin was shifting, but the officer wasn't ready to back down. "This isn't a courtroom," he snapped. "We're trying to ensure the safety and security of all passengers. If someone is found with stolen property, it's our duty to intervene." "And have you found anything?" the woman pressed. "Have you searched Miss Carter's belongings?" The officer opened his mouth to respond but faltered. He hadn't conducted a search, not yet. His hesitation only fueled the growing unease among the passengers. Sophia seized the opportunity. "If you truly believe I'm in possession of stolen property, she said, then search my bag. Right here in front of everyone. I have nothing to hide. Her words were met with a collective intake of breath. The officer's face hardened, and he glanced at Captain Miller, silently seeking his approval. Miller looked conflicted, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was spiraling out of control. Finally, he nodded. Let's proceed with the search, he said reluctantly. We need to put this matter to rest. Sophia calmly stepped aside and handed her carry-on bag to the officer. She watched as he unzipped it and began rifling through its contents. Passengers craned their necks to see, their curiosity now bordering on voyeurism. Some whispered to each other, while others filmed the scene with wide-eyed fascination. The officer searched methodically, pulling out items one by one: a neatly folded sweater, a travel-sized toiletry bag, a charger, a hardcover book. Sophia stood motionless, her expression unreadable. She felt the weight of every gaze in the cabin, but she refused to let it break her composure. When the officer reached the bottom of the bag and found nothing unusual, his frustration was evident. He placed the items back into the bag with a heavy sigh and turned to face Sophia. That doesn't prove anything, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Exactly, Sophia replied, her tone sharp. You found nothing because there was nothing to find. So now what? Will you continue to tarnish my reputation based on baseless accusations, or will you admit that you've made a mistake? The officer shifted uncomfortably, his confidence visibly eroding. Captain Miller stepped forward, his expression stern. This has gone far enough, he said, addressing both the officer and Sophia. We'll review the report once we land, but for now, I suggest everyone return to their seats. Let's not cause any further disruption. But before anyone could move, another voice rang out from the back of the plane. Wait a minute, what about my bag? It was a young man in his 20s, standing near the rear galley. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face and looked distinctly nervous. All eyes turned toward him, and a new wave of murmurs swept through the cabin. The officer's gaze narrowed as he approached the man. Are you the one who filed the report? He asked. The man hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, he said, his voice shaky. I thought someone might have taken it. The officer frowned. What exactly was missing? The man hesitated again, glancing around nervously. It's just a wallet. I thought I left it in my bag, but now I'm not so sure. The tension in the cabin shifted, confusion replacing outrage. Passengers exchanged puzzled looks, and some began to suspect that the young man's report might not be as credible as it seemed. Sophia crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. So you're saying you're not even sure if your wallet was stolen? She asked pointedly. You accused me based on a hunch. The young man stammered, his face turning red. I didn't mean to accuse anyone specifically, he said weakly. I just thought, I wasn't sure. Sophia shook her head, her disappointment evident. Your uncertainty has caused unnecessary harm, she said. You should think twice before making baseless accusations that can ruin someone's reputation. The young man looked down, clearly ashamed, and the officer stepped back, his authority diminished. Captain Miller sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. This has been a disaster, he muttered under his breath. Sophia turned to him, her voice calm but firm. A disaster you allowed to happen, she said. Your crew failed to handle this situation with the professionalism and discretion it deserved. I hope you'll take this as a lesson. Captain Miller opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the flight attendant Mia stepped forward again. Miss Carter, she said softly, her voice tinged with guilt. On behalf of the crew, I'm so sorry for how this was handled. Sophia gave her a small nod, appreciating the sincerity of the apology. But as she returned to her seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. There were still unanswered questions, and the damage done to her dignity would take much longer to repair. As the plane settled back into an uneasy quiet, Sophia leaned against her seat, staring out the window into the vast expanse of clouds. The whispers among the passengers hadn't stopped, their hushed tones keeping her humiliation alive. She wanted to believe that the worst was over, but something deep in her gut told her this incident had stirred up more than anyone realized. Across the aisle, the older woman who had spoken up earlier caught Sophia's eye and gave her a reassuring nod. Sophia managed a faint smile in return. It was comforting to know that not everyone on the flight had been so quick to judge her, though the sting of those who had lingered. Meanwhile, at the back of the plane, the young man who had reported the missing wallet shifted nervously in his seat. His leg bounced uncontrollably as he stared at the tray table in front of him, avoiding eye contact with anyone. A middle-aged man sitting next to him leaned over and whispered something, and the younger man nodded hastily, as if trying to brush off the conversation. Mia, the flight attendant, had retreated to the galley, her hands trembling as she reached for a bottle of water. She couldn't stop replaying the scene in her mind, the officer's commanding tone, Sophia's calm defiance, the way the passengers had turned into a murmuring jury. She felt a deep sense of guilt for not intervening earlier, for not insisting on a more respectful approach. "Hey, Mia," another flight attendant said, startling her. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Maya hesitated, then nodded quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a lot to process." Her colleague gave her a sympathetic look. These kinds of things happen sometimes. People get worked up, tensions rise. It'll blow over. Mia wasn't so sure. Something about the whole ordeal didn't sit right with her. But she couldn't put her finger on it. She glanced toward the officer, who was now seated at the front of the plane, his posture rigid, his gaze distant. He seemed deep in thought, perhaps questioning his own actions, or planning his next move. Back in her seat, Sophia couldn't relax. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this young man? Why had he been so quick to involve the authorities? And why had the officer been so willing to act on such flimsy evidence? The more she thought about it, the less sense it made. She pulled out her phone, switching it to airplane mode, and opened the Notes app. Typing quickly, she jotted down everything she could remember about the incident, the officer's words, the young man's demeanor, the reactions of the passengers. It wasn't much, but she wanted a record of the events while they were still fresh in her mind. As she typed, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me," the older woman said, leaning across the aisle. "I just wanted to say I admire how you handled yourself back there. It's not easy to stay calm in a situation like that." Sophia looked up, surprised by the kindness in her tone. "Thank you," she said softly. "It wasn't easy, but I couldn't let them treat me like that." The woman nodded. "You were right to stand your ground. I'm Olivia, by the way. Olivia Hart." "Sophia Carter," she replied, shaking her hand. "Well, Miss Carter," Olivia said, her voice firm. "If you ever need a witness to what happened today, you can count on me. I've seen too many people railroaded by assumptions and poor judgment. It's infuriating." Sophia smiled, her gratitude genuine. "That means a lot, Olivia. Thank you." As the two women talked quietly, another conversation was taking place a few rows back. Two passengers who had been silently observing the drama earlier were now piecing together their own theories. "Did you see how nervous that kid looked?" one of them whispered. "Yeah," the other replied. "And did you notice he didn't even check his bag before reporting the wallet missing?" "Who does that?" "I don't know," the first said, lowering their voice further. "But something about this doesn't add up." The murmurs of suspicion spread slowly but surely. Some passengers began casting sideways glances at the young man, their curiosity growing. Others started to feel a pang of regret for assuming Sophia's guilt so quickly. Sophia noticed the shift in energy around her but didn't let herself dwell on it. Her focus was on staying composed and gathering her thoughts. She didn't know what awaited her once the plane landed, but she was determined to be ready for anything. As the flight continued, the officer received a call on his airline-issued device. He leaned in to listen, his expression unreadable. After a brief exchange, he hung up and stood, glancing toward the young man at the back of the plane. Sophia noticed the movement and felt a pang of unease. Was this about her, or was something else at play? The officer made his way down the aisle, his face tense. He stopped at the young man's row and leaned in, speaking in a low voice. The young man's eyes widened and he shook his head rapidly, his words coming out in a rushed whisper. Whatever they were discussing, it was clear the young man was panicking. Sophia's curiosity grew, but she forced herself to stay seated, knowing she had already drawn enough attention for one flight. Still, the tension in the air was palpable, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the truth behind this incident was more complicated than anyone had imagined. The officer's hushed conversation with the young man seemed to stretch on forever. From where she sat, Sophia could see the nervous glances the young man was shooting around the cabin. His shoulders were tense, his breathing visibly rapid. Whatever was being said wasn't just a passing remark, it was something significant. Passengers nearby tried to act like they weren't watching, but their curiosity betrayed them. Eyes darted toward the officer and the young man, stealing glances between muffled whispers. A growing sense of unease rippled through the cabin. Sophia's gaze flicked toward Olivia, who was watching the scene intently. They exchanged a look. Neither of them spoke, but the same thought passed between them. Something deeper was going on here. The officer stood abruptly, his presence commanding as he motioned for the young man to follow him. The young man hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of his seat tightly. The officer said something more, his tone firm, and reluctantly, the young man rose. As they moved toward the front of the plane, the young man stumbled slightly, his steps unsure. The officer placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward. For a brief moment, their path took them directly past Sophia. The young man's eyes met hers, wide and filled with something she couldn't quite place. Fear? Guilt? Desperation? Sophia felt her heart quicken. She wanted to reach out, to ask him what was going on, but she held back. This wasn't her fight, or at least it hadn't been. But now, with every passing moment, it was starting to feel like there was more at stake than her own dignity. They reached the front of the plane, where the officer leaned in close to the young man, speaking quietly again. The young man shook his head, his body language defensive. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening, but the low voices made it impossible to hear. Sophia couldn't sit still any longer. She turned to Olivia. "Something's not right," she whispered. "Did you see the way he looked at me? Like he knows something he's too scared to say." Olivia nodded, her brow furrowed. "I saw it. Whatever this is, it's bigger than a missing wallet." In the galley, Mia watched the interaction with mounting concern. She could feel the tension rising, not just among the passengers but within herself. She knew this was more than just a simple misunderstanding. Her instincts told her to intervene, but she hesitated. What could she say? What could she do? The officer turned and walked briskly to his seat, leaving the young man standing awkwardly at the front of the plane. The young man looked around, his eyes scanning the faces of the passengers as though searching for someone, perhaps an ally, perhaps an escape. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. I need to say something," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. The cabin fell silent. All eyes were on him now, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Sophia sat up straighter, her pulse racing. Whatever he was about to say, she had a feeling it was going to change everything. The young man hesitated, his hands trembling at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could, the officer stood and barked, "That's enough. Sit down." The young man flinched, his face pale. For a moment, it seemed like he might obey. But then, as if summoning some hidden reserve of courage, he straightened his posture and shook his head. "No," he said firmly, his voice louder this time. "I can't stay silent anymore." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Sophia leaned forward, her heart pounding. The young man's defiance was electrifying, and the tension in the air was so thick it was almost tangible. The officer took a step forward, his face a mask of irritation. "You're causing a disturbance," he said coldly. "Sit down now, or there will be consequences." But the young man didn't move. His eyes darted around the cabin, landing briefly on Sophia before settling on the officer. "This is wrong," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "All of it. I have to tell the truth." Sophia's breath caught. The truth? What truth? The officer stepped closer, his tone icy. "If you have something to say, you can say it after we land." But the young man shook his head again. "No, people need to know now." The plane seemed to hold its collective breath as everyone waited for him to continue. Maya stepped out of the galley, her expression uncertain but determined. "Maybe we should hear him out," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. The officer glared at her, but she stood her ground. Sophia's hands clenched into fists. Whatever was about to happen, she could feel it building to a breaking point. The young man was on the verge of revealing something big, something that might explain everything. The officer's face darkened. "You're making a mistake," he warned the young man. But the young man ignored him. Taking a deep breath, he looked around the cabin one last time, then began to speak. The young man's voice trembled as he began to speak, but his determination was evident. "This isn't about a wallet," he said, his words slicing through the tense air. "It's about something much bigger." The officer moved closer, his tone sharp and authoritative. "Stop now, I'm warning you." But the young man didn't falter. He took another shaky breath, his eyes darting between the passengers, searching for someone, anyone, who might understand. "I didn't say anything because I was scared. I thought keeping quiet would protect me, but now I see that staying silent only helps the people trying to cover up the truth." Sophia's pulse raced. The words carried a weight that suggested layers of deception and danger. She glanced at Olivia, whose expression was a mix of curiosity and concern. Whatever the young man was holding back, it wasn't just personal. It felt systemic, something with far-reaching consequences. Then he said it. "The officer, he planted the wallet. I didn't steal anything." The cabin erupted into murmurs, gasps of disbelief, and hushed accusations. Passengers exchanged incredulous looks, their confusion palpable. Mia took a step forward, her face tight with shock. Sophia's eyes widened. She looked at the officer, who remained calm, too calm. His face was unreadable, but the stillness in his demeanor was chilling. It wasn't the reaction of someone unjustly accused. It was the reaction of someone calculating their next move. "You're lying," the officer said flatly, his voice low but menacing. "Don't make this worse for yourself." The young man shook his head, his courage growing with each word. "I saw you. You dropped it under the seat when you passed by earlier. I didn't say anything because I didn't think anyone would believe me. But now I can't just sit here and let you ruin my life." The passengers were no longer whispering. Their voices grew louder, their outrage simmering just beneath the surface. A man in the back shouted, "Is this true? Did you see anything?" While others demanded answers from the officer. Sophia felt a spark ignite within her. The pieces of the puzzle started to click into place. The officer's insistence on removing the young man, his refusal to explain himself, the cryptic looks exchanged earlier. It wasn't just about the wallet. This was about power, control, and someone being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But before she could speak, the officer took a step toward the young man, his voice sharp and commanding. "Enough. Sit down. We'll sort this out when we land." The young man hesitated, his resolve wavering under the officer's glare. But just as he seemed on the verge of backing down, another voice cut through the noise. "I saw it too," a woman near the middle of the plane said. She stood up, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the officer. "I saw you drop something under the seat when you walked by earlier. I thought it was strange, but I didn't want to get involved." The cabin went silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Sophia's breath caught. This was it, the moment the scales tipped. The young man wasn't alone anymore. The officer's face darkened, his calm facade cracking ever so slightly. He turned toward the woman, his voice laced with irritation. "You must be mistaken. I didn't drop anything." But the woman shook her head, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "I know what I saw." The tension in the air was electric. Passengers began to murmur again, their voices rising in disbelief and anger. Another person spoke up, then another, each one adding their observations, their suspicions. Sophia felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it seemed like the tide was turning, but just as quickly as it came, her optimism was replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. The officer wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed more resolute, more dangerous. Then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, the officer reached for his radio. "We have a situation," he said, his voice steady and professional. "I need backup at the gate when we land." The words sent a ripple of fear through the cabin. Backup. What did he mean by that? Was he calling for help? Or was this a ploy to regain control? Sophia's mind raced. She couldn't just sit there and let the officer dictate the narrative. She stood up, her voice clear and strong. "We all saw what happened. You can't just silence us." The officer turned to her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the two locked eyes, and Sophia felt the weight of the confrontation bearing down on her. But before either of them could speak, the plane suddenly jolted, the seatbelt sign dinging back on. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The command momentarily broke the tension, passengers reluctantly sitting down as the plane steadied. But the conflict was far from over. Sophia knew this was just the beginning. The officer's radio call, the young man's courage, the woman's testimony, it was all building toward something. And whatever that something was, it felt like it would change everything. As the plane continued its descent, tension gripped the cabin like a tightly coiled spring. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, each trying to piece together the rapidly unfolding events. The officer stood rigid near the young man, his radio clipped back onto his belt, his face betraying no emotion. Sophia's heart pounded, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her. This wasn't just about a wallet or a single confrontation. This was about justice, about doing what was right despite the risks. The captain's voice came through the intercom once more, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please remain seated until we've safely arrived at the gate." But the calm tone did little to dispel the storm brewing within the cabin. As the plane touched down, the tension reached its peak. The officer's hand hovered near his holster, a silent warning to anyone who might think of escalating the situation further. Sophia scanned the cabin, noticing the faces of the passengers, some filled with fear, others with quiet determination. Olivia gave her a brief, reassuring nod. It was a silent acknowledgement that they couldn't let this end here. The plane came to a stop, and almost immediately, the officer moved toward the front, motioning for the young man to stand. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. But before the young man could comply, the woman who had spoken up earlier stood again, her voice steady. "No, he's not going anywhere until someone checks that wallet." Her words ignited a ripple of agreement throughout the cabin. Others joined in, their voices growing louder, stronger. "Search it. Let's see what's really going on." The officer hesitated, the first sign of doubt flashing across his face. He turned toward the crowd, his voice rising in frustration. "This is a security matter. I need everyone to stay out of it." But the passengers weren't backing down. One man pulled out his phone, its camera aimed squarely at the officer. "If you're telling the truth, then there's no harm in proving it. Let us see." The young man stepped forward, his voice clear but filled with emotion. "Check the wallet. If it's mine, it'll have my ID. If it's not, then we'll know the truth." The officer's jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like he might refuse, but with the crowd pressing in, their demands growing louder, he relented. Pulling the wallet from his pocket, he held it up for everyone to see. "Fine," he said, his tone clipped. "We'll settle this." He opened the wallet, flipping through its contents. The cabin fell silent, everyone holding their breath. And then, as he pulled out an ID card, the truth became glaringly clear. The name and face on the card didn't match the young man. It didn't belong to him or anyone else on the plane. The officer's confident facade cracked, replaced by a flicker of panic. "Whose wallet is it, then?" Sophia's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unwavering. The officer didn't answer. His hand trembled slightly as he stuffed the wallet back into his pocket. But before he could make another move, the captain appeared at the cabin door, flanked by two airport security officers. "What's going on here?" the captain demanded, his authoritative tone silencing the crowd. Passengers immediately began shouting over one another, explaining what had happened, accusing the officer of misconduct. The young man stepped forward, recounting his story with remarkable composure. The airport security officers exchanged glances, their expressions serious. One of them turned to the officer. "Sir, we'll need to speak with you privately. Please come with us." The officer's face hardened. "This is a misunderstanding. I was doing my job." But the security officers weren't swayed. "We'll sort it out," Let's go. As the officer was escorted off the plane, the tension in the cabin finally began to lift. Passengers murmured amongst themselves, some cheering quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Sophia exhaled deeply, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like hours. She turned to Olivia, who was smiling faintly. "You did it," Olivia said softly. "No," Sophia replied, glancing at the young man. "He did." As the passengers began to gather their belongings, one final twist emerged. The woman who had spoken up earlier approached Sophia and Olivia, her expression troubled. "There's something else you should know," she said in a low voice. "What is it?" Sophia asked, her brow furrowing. The woman hesitated, then glanced around to ensure no one else was listening. "That officer, I've seen him before. On another flight. There was another incident, something similar." Sophia's stomach dropped. "What are you saying?" The woman nodded grimly. "I think this wasn't the first time, and if we don't speak up, it won't be the last." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air as the passengers began to disembark. Sophia knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger fight for accountability and justice.